Boldwood presents Summer at Forget-Me-Not Cottage. Written by Helen Rolfe and read by Sarah Cullum. The moral right of the author has been asserted. The performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Morgan Rees never thought she'd come back to Little Woodville, let alone be here for so long. She'd come here to be with her mum, Elena, intended it to be for a month, 6 weeks at most, before she loaded up her car and drove the long journey up to Edinburgh to join her fiancé, Ronan. And yet here she was, 7 months later, still in the quaint chocolate box village in the Cotswolds. She closed the front door to Forget-Me-Not Cottage behind her, and lightly cradling a spring bouquet, she locked up before heading out into the sunshine. Every time she did this, made her way to the end of the path, went through the little gate at the end and turned back as she pulled it to and flipped the little latch into place, she was reminded that nothing would ever be the same again. Her mum was gone, and Morgan wouldn't trade the time they'd spent together for anything, not even for Ronan, the man she'd promised to spend the rest of her life with. Forget-Me-Not Cottage had had its name for a long time before Elena moved into it with her 2 daughters, Morgan and Tegan, and on the border of the front path were the charming blue blooms with their yellow centres, a feature that came and went with the seasons and had done ever since they'd arrived. Elena had kept the tradition going despite not being much of a gardener. That was what Little Woodville was like, really, in a nutshell. People respected the village for its inclusivity, its welcome, its character, which included little touches like the appropriate flowers if you owned a residence with a particular name. Morgan hadn't always appreciated the special touch the forget-me-nots added, but she did now it was almost summer, and the little flowers added colour to the front garden of the cottage, both beside the path and in the bed below the front window, where Elena had insisted on planting more. Morgan headed across the village green and down towards the high street, aware of how different her surroundings would be when she eventually left Little Woodville for good. Rather than thatched roofs and the closeness of a smaller community, the city of Edinburgh was busy, diverse, and had an eclectic mix of buildings. She'd only been twice, both times with Ronan to visit his family, but it was a move that she'd agreed to and that had excited her for a time. Now, she felt unsure, but she suspected that was the grief talking, the unwillingness to accept that this part of her life was behind her, and a lot of it had to do with how busy she was dealing with the practicalities, including getting her mum's cottage ready for sale and wading through all the stock Elena had collected for the market stalls she'd run in the village as a hobby and a source of extra income. When she reached the high street, she turned left, crossed the road, and made her way over the small humpback bridge that straddled over a shallow stream. She paused at the top, smiling. She remembered this place well. She'd played poo sticks on more than one occasion with her mum and older sister Tegan, and on the occasions their mum had let go of some of the tension she tended to carry with her, it had been fun. But those times were few and far between. Tegan and Morgan didn't always get the fun Elena, the one who wanted them around her for company. What Morgan and her sister had had more often than not was a stressed mother working long hours, both as a secretary and at a supermarket to make ends meet, since their dad walked out and never came back. Morgan remembered school uniforms being bought 2 sizes too big so they lasted, never being allowed to buy school dinner like their friends, not having family holidays apart from 2 short camping trips to Norfolk when a lot of their friends went further afield, not having much time when the 3 of them simply enjoyed one another's company. Morgan had written to their dad to tell him that Elena had died, and he'd sent a sympathy card, but that was the extent of his involvement, and neither Morgan nor Tegan longed for it to be anything else. She walked on, and when she reached the other side of the bridge, she turned left and meandered on until she came to Snowdrop Cottage. She felt herself mellow as she opened the periwinkle gate with its white plaque depicting the name of the residence. At least she'd have some company today. It had been a couple of months since her mum died. Then there had been the funeral, the wake, the empty days afterwards, even though Ronan had asked her to go back to Scotland with him. And now she was nervous, because although she had been here enough times for dinner, she'd usually had her mum at her side, and she really hoped that she didn't let her emotions get the better of her if well-meaning friends expressed their sympathies today. Late spring held a promise of more fine weather to come, with summer just around the corner, and floral notes scented the air around the cottage that was illustrative of quintessential England. This was the sort of home that reminded you of the beauty the country had to offer, with its thatched roof and ivy creeping across the front walls. Between January and March especially, visitors were drawn to Little Woodville and the impressive display of snowdrops. Snowdrop Cottage was one of the places to see them at their very best, with the idyllic cottage showing off snowdrops that surrounded the front and to the side. Then, as you drove on and turned into Snowdrop Lane, you realised how the road had got its name because in season, on either side were swathes of the dainty, white flowers nodding their heads in welcome. Sebastian Hadley owned this stunning cottage, a piece of Little Woodville's character, named after the flowers that grew around it in abundance. But it was Belle, Sebastian's girlfriend and business partner, who answered the door. Belle held open her arms. "Welcome back to Little Woodville." She embraced her friend. "Again?" "I've only been away for a couple of weeks this time," Morgan laughed. She'd been up to Edinburgh to see Ronan, a far less melancholy trip than the one she'd taken right after the funeral. She'd got more of a feel for the city, been able to open her eyes to so much more of it. "Well, you were missed." Belle made an elegant hostess with her long, dark hair wound up in a chignon, leaving her fringe hanging loose. When Morgan had come home to the village to look after her mother, Ronan had taken the job he'd been offered in Scotland. They'd agreed it was for the best that he forge ahead with what they'd both planned together. And that was definitely a savvy career move, the next step up in his career as a financial planner with a generous relocation package. The last thing Morgan had wanted when she knew her mum needed her was for him to stay in England out of guilt. She knew it would make her feel terrible too, and she'd had enough to deal with at the time back at Forget-Me-Not Cottage. But Ronan missed her, given she'd been left behind in England for far longer than either of them had anticipated, and she'd missed him. So after he mentioned yet again that it was crazy how long they'd been apart, she headed on up to Edinburgh for a surprise visit. And in truth, it had been good to go there again, to get away and really take a look at the new life that was waiting for her. She'd felt comfort being back in his arms too, because she hadn't been to stay with him since right after the funeral, when he whisked her away from it all. "It's so good to have you back." Belle smiled. There was a time when Belle had been away from the village for an extended period before returning for family commitments long before Morgan, but it was something they had in common, and after they got chatting on more than one occasion when Morgan visited the bookshop cafe, they'd struck up a friendship that Morgan had come to value. "It's really nice to be wanted." Although Morgan knew it made it more difficult because this was only temporary. Slowly, without realising, the embrace of the village had grabbed a hold of her, and already she knew it would be hard to let go. She'd assumed everyone would have realised that when her mum died, she'd get sorted and then move on with her own life. But either people in the village had forgotten, or they were just being their usual welcoming selves and not making her feel as though her time was up. "For you." Morgan passed Belle the bouquet she'd held out of the way when the hostess welcomed her. She might not live here with Sebastian just yet, both of them having decided they didn't want to rush things, but it always felt like it was her home too. "They're beautiful, thank you." Belle leaned in to inhale the scent of freesias, tulips and roses, a brightly coloured arrangement perfect for the season. She indicated for Morgan to hang her denim jacket on one of the hooks behind the front door as Sebastian appeared from the kitchen at the end of the hallway, arms outstretched to welcome their next guest. The cottage was as gorgeous inside as out. To one side of the hallway was a lounge with a wood burner in situ. The once-was dining room was on the other side, with an open fireplace and a casual setup of a big reading chair and a coffee table and a comfy sofa. During the dinners she and her mum had been to, talk at the table had often centred around the changes the cottage had had over the years, how it had evolved sympathetically and still held its character. "Go through, everyone's waiting," Sebastian told her, green eyes that spoke of kindness twinkling as he welcomed her. "Am I late?" she wondered. "Not at all," said Belle. "And you're not the last either." When Morgan and her mum Elena had first come here for dinner, Elena had explained the history of these gatherings as well as the background of the cottage. The cottage had originally been owned by Belle's gran, Gillian, but Sebastian had been the tenant for a while. He'd ended up buying the cottage, and Gillian was now living in a residential care home. Sebastian had continued the tradition Gillian had started by making dinner for anyone in the village who wanted or needed the company. Gillian even came along to some of the dinners, as she didn't want to miss out, and whenever she was here, as she was today, you could tell how proud she was that Sebastian had kept them going. Elena and Morgan had joined in with the dinners several times over the last few months, when Elena was up to it. They weren't always on a weekend. They weren't every week necessarily, depending on people's commitments, but they happened with regularity. At first, Morgan had thought her mum needed companionship, and that was why she insisted they came along. But with Elena constantly feeling the need to apologise for derailing her youngest daughter's life, Morgan began to suspect the real reason behind it was that her mother wanted another chance to remind Morgan of the village that had once been her home, the love and friendship that was still here if she could open up to the possibility. "Something smells good," Morgan declared as they went into the kitchen, a bright space with windows at the back. She smiled in greeting as everyone called out their welcome to the latest arrival. "Roast chicken with all the trimmings." Belle pulled out a vase from a corner cupboard and filled it with water, as Sebastian took his station at the Aga. "It's still officially spring. We can get away with it. Soon it'll be summer and nobody will want a roast." "Speak for yourself," Gillian called out. "Sebastian is such a good cook. I wouldn't say no to any of his meals, and I bet nobody else would either." Belle's gran was already in situ at the smooth wood table in the charming kitchen with wooden cabinetry that suited the cottage down to the ground. Belle gave Morgan's arm a reassuring squeeze before she opened up the flower arrangement to put the blooms into the vase. Local teacher Anne arrived next, followed by Barbara, who did a lot of work at the church. Gillian patted a chair next to her. "Come sit down, Morgan. It's good to see you again. How are you keeping?" Gillian might no longer be a resident of the village, but she'd never stopped caring. She understood Morgan and Elena more than most, as just like Morgan and her mother had endured a bit of a strained relationship for a time, Gillian had had the same with her own daughter, Delia. Belle had given her a brief story of what had gone on without breaking confidences, but Gillian and Belle's mum Delia were lucky. They'd patched things up before it was too late and were in regular contact, even though Delia and Belle's dad lived in Ireland now. Knowing their story when Belle shared it had made Morgan value her time back in the village all the more. What had been an alteration of her own life's plan had given her and her mum the chance to get to know one another again. They'd never had a huge falling out, but their difficult relationship had been as a result of Morgan growing up feeling that Elena didn't really have time for her or Tegan. Sometimes the girls had felt in the way, and so leaving for university hadn't come soon enough for Morgan, and then she joined the workforce as a journalist and had never moved home permanently again. Tegan and Elena had mended bridges a long time ago, which Morgan suspected had a lot to do with the fact that Tegan had kids and wanted their grandma to be a part of their lives. But Morgan hadn't managed to reach the same stage with their mother until she came back this time. Morgan accepted a glass of water that Betty from the bakery had poured for her. "Thank you, Betty. And I'm doing okay. Thanks for asking, Gillian." She smiled inwardly. Sometimes at these gatherings it was hard to get a word in edgeways even when you were directly asked a question, but rather than it being a frustration, it was all part of the tapestry of Little Woodville. "You know that everyone here is looking out for you, don't you?" Gillian pointed out. "We are," chimed in Jeremy, adding his 2 pennies worth. Jeremy, in his 70s, was a close match in age to Gillian and a lively, friendly character. "Otherwise we'll have Gillian to answer to." Gillian's glance of agreement proved he was correct. Morgan noticed Belle looking over at her gran fondly as she commanded a presence in the cottage that had once been hers. Belle had also told Morgan how much she'd missed her gran when her mum had taken her away from the village, and how being in her life once again had made it whole. It sounded like such a dramatic statement, but the emotion layering Belle's voice when she told Morgan that had been clear, and Morgan got it because she felt the same way about her mum. It was hard to contemplate leaving all these people behind when she eventually went up to Scotland. Sometimes, living on her own in the cottage, it was easy to forget she was going to be married. She had a wedding to plan and had so far done nothing. But she would, soon. Ronan had proposed after only 1 year together, and saying yes had come naturally. And he'd always made it clear he wanted to move back to Edinburgh, his birthplace. He'd mentioned it the first night they got talking in a cocktail bar, introduced by a mutual friend. And you didn't mention that sort of thing to a girl you'd only just met if it wasn't what you truly wanted as part of your life's plan. "Coming here without Mum is a bit weird," Morgan admitted to everyone, although she felt less emotional than she'd expected. Instead, she felt comfortable. Trevor, a man similar in age to Jeremy and Gillian and a good friend of Gillian's, was the last to arrive at Snowdrop Cottage amidst many jokes that he lived the closest and should really have been there first. And once they were all seated, it was a bit of a squash in the kitchen but cosy. Belle and Sebastian delivered platters, bowls and plates to the table, the roast dinner laid out like a magnificent feast. Conversations battled to be heard. Laughter rang around the table, the entire room filled with a welcome warmth. "Any plans to go back to the Snowdrop Lane markets?" Belle passed Morgan the gravy boat. Little Woodville was host to the Snowdrop Lane markets once a week, every Saturday. If you turned right out of the front gate to Snowdrop Cottage and kept walking, you'd reach Snowdrop Lane before too long. And a couple of 100 metres up the lane was a wide, open expanse bordered by snowdrop woods. It was in that open space that the markets were held, and Elena had had a stall there for years. Morgan, during her time back in the village, had helped her out and stepped in to run it solo on the days her mother wasn't up to it. "I should do it soon, I know that much." Morgan pushed a piece of stuffing onto her fork and ran it through a puddle of gravy. Ronan had asked the same question, although he'd suggested she do the speedier option and sell everything on eBay. Mum accumulated a lot of stock. She was forever buying things that caught her eye. "Probably the best way to do it," Anne approved from the other end of the table. "I have to buy things as I see them or I forget." The trouble with Mum was that she collected things way faster than she sold them. She was always fretting she'd missed out on a bargain, and I already know it'll take weeks to shift everything. You'll have it done in no time at the markets, Gillian assured her. Elena was a lot of fun, Barbara declared. She was a jolly woman who always had time for whoever wanted a chat. I remember being at the markets when she sold Jasper's wallet by mistake. I haven't heard that story, said Morgan as laughter erupted. And rather than feel a wave of grief, she had a curiosity to know more, to glean as many extra details about her mum as she could. How on earth did it happen? The murmur in the room also begged the question about the wallet belonging to the market manager. Barbara explained. Elena had a near identical one priced up and for sale. Beautiful Italian leather it was. But when Jasper was helping her put up the sign at her stall that morning, his wallet must have fallen out of his pocket right next to the one she had, and Elena sold it. To gasps, she responded with an animated tale of how Elena had chased after the man when she realised she'd sold someone's actual wallet. I thought she was going to rugby tackle him to the ground. Morgan was pleased she hadn't, but she loved the story and the amusement and applause the tale got. Barbara's arms supporting her bosom beneath a lightweight grey jumper continued. She swapped it with the other one, and when Jasper saw the commotion, that was when he realised he'd lost his wallet. He bought her the biggest bunch of flowers he could find on Hildy's flower stall. Bright pinks, purples, yellow. He was so relieved to have it back. Peter, Betty's husband, wondered, didn't the man realise it was on the heavy side when he bought it? He thanked Anne, who was sitting next to him as she picked up his herringbone cap that had been knocked from the wooden finial on his chair and put it back in position. Morgan wondered if he ever went anywhere without his cap, apart from the bakery, of course. Maybe Jasper, like the rest of us, doesn't use much cash anymore, Sebastian suggested. Perhaps the man thought the cards inside were fake. You do get those fake cards when you buy a purse or wallet, Anne agreed, fork poised in the air. Gillian leaned closer to Morgan and said, Bet he didn't think they were fake. Bet he was cursing your mum for catching up with him when he'd almost got away with it. I'll bet he was too, agreed Morgan, with a feeling of mischief as the banter at the table continued and she and Gillian fell into an easy chat. I remember your mother at one of these dinners telling us about a beautiful silver antique tray she sold at her stall. Gillian cut into a roast potato and its heat curled into the air. She sold it to a young boy, thought it would be a gift for someone, and then that evening she found him using it to sledge down the sloping part of the village green. Morgan burst out laughing. She could imagine her mum thinking that was terrible and wishing she'd sold it to someone who'd appreciate it more. Elena had always loved finding hidden treasures at bits and bobs shops, or, more recently, because that's all she could cope with, online. And she'd always imagined the sort of homes the items would end up in, who would be the new owners. It was the reason Morgan couldn't just pack everything up and get rid of it. Her mother would have wanted all the things she'd chosen to be sold at the stall, and so that was what Morgan had decided to do. Tegan had agreed too, which meant a lot because there'd been a tension between them on the day of the funeral, and Morgan didn't want anything else to add to it. Both Tegan and Morgan were executors of Elena's will and had so far managed to deal with everything over the phone or via email as they ploughed through the tasks the best they could. But tomorrow, Tegan was coming back to the village again for the day and an overnight stay, leaving the farm she ran with her husband Henry in his capable hands. The sisters had always got on well enough, saw each other when they could, but Morgan got the impression there was something Tegan wasn't telling her. Or was it just grief creating tension that might simply pass in time? Morgan turned back into the conversation around the table as they ate. Betty and Peter talked about their travel plans in the autumn to see family. Barbara complained about the amount of work that needed doing in the churchyard to keep it tidy, and Sebastian assured her he'd be over to take a look soon. With the bookshop cafe on Little Woodville's High Street, his new venture, he was no longer the caretaker at the school, but he still took care of the grounds around the church, which Morgan had noticed were immaculate. As voices filled the kitchen, Morgan caught Belle's eye and they shared a giggle each time either of them tried to speak and gave up because it was too hard. When the meal came to its conclusion, Morgan helped clear the table and scraped the plates into the compost with Belle's help. They could hear Jeremy and Trevor talking about their late wives, first dates, romantic gestures. Imagine being so in love with someone that 50 years isn't enough. Morgan sighed wistfully as she overheard Trevor. She piled the final plate onto the stack beside the sink. "Surely you feel that way about Ronan?" said Belle. Of course. They were engaged. He'd welcomed her into his family, and they were all such wonderful people. His mother was quiet and kind with a touch of class, his father polite and clever. She'd be a part of the clan, a phrase they used often when talking about family, and she quite liked it. Sebastian came up behind Belle and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Think we can go the distance? 50 years? Belle turned into his embrace and put her hands on either side of his face. "Definitely. Think we'll be doing these dinners in 50 years? "Not sure. Maybe someone else can be the chef. We'll be the guests." Belle flushed when Sebastian patted her on the bottom. They were a lovely couple, together romantically and in business, and they were both well and truly on the same page. It felt an apt way to think of them when they owned and ran the bookshop cafe in Little Woodville. Jeremy was talking about how much his wife had enjoyed coastal drives in Devon. Morgan leaned closer to Belle as they listened in. "Jeremy nearly ran me over yesterday," she confided so only Sebastian and Belle could hear. "I was crossing the high street and he came out of nowhere." "Doesn't surprise me," said Belle as Sebastian took over loading the dishwasher with what he could squeeze in. "You've got to have your eyes in the back of your head when he's on the roads." "He really should think about stopping driving altogether," Sebastian agreed as he picked up more cutlery. "But try telling him that. He thinks he's quite capable of local drives, nipping down to the high street and back. Tells me it's not like he goes on any main roads." "Hardly the point," Belle whispered. "Maybe I'll have another quiet word with him," said Sebastian, raking a hand through messy, dark hair. "Probably best done over a pint at the Rose and Thatch." "You're a good man." Belle planted a kiss on his cheek, and despite their guests, it was as though it was the two of them in their own little world. Morgan wondered, had she and Ronan ever been like that? Maybe at the start. Perhaps the key was that these two didn't live together yet, whereas she and Ronan had begun sharing her flat pretty quickly after they got together. Maybe they'd leapt right into domestic life and missed one of the most exciting steps. But she supposed the end goal was the same, being together. "I need to rest my voice." Belle hooked Morgan's arm as she led her from the kitchen along the hallway. Plenty of people were still here, but Morgan needed the fresh air and a bit of peace now, so a walk home would do her good. "I didn't get to talk much. My voice is fine," Morgan laughed. "You were an excellent hostess, by the way. Kind of like a permanent fixture." Belle rolled her eyes at the teasing. It was nothing she hadn't heard before, because she was always here at the cottage, despite keeping the flat above the bookshop cafe. But if Morgan was a betting woman, she wouldn't mind guessing that it wouldn't be long before Snowdrop Cottage became Belle's permanent address too. Chapter 2. Nate Greene filled a trolley at the supermarket. He was visiting Little Woodville all the way from Wales, but he knew that if he went to his dad Trevor's place first before he came here, his dad would likely insist that he saved his money rather than restocking his elderly father's kitchen cupboards. And Nate couldn't do that. He was staying the entire weekend, and he had no intention of letting his dad cook for him or fund all the ingredients. He threw in a couple of packets of his dad's favourite biscuits and another big box of tea bags. Nate drove on from there to the village he'd grown up in, his dog Branston, aptly named after his favourite sandwich accompaniment, in the passenger side of his pickup. But when he pulled up outside his dad's place and knocked on the front door, there was no answer. Great. He looked down at Branston, who was already sniffing around the doorway. What 75-year-old man is out gallivanting at 8 p.m. in the evening? The spaniel gazed up at him, as if pondering the same. Nate went back over to the pickup to get Branston's lead. He doubted his dad would be too long. He was probably at the pub or a neighbour's place, so they'd have a decent walk, which they both needed after being stuck in traffic for so long. The perishables, the milk and the cheese, would be fine in the truck now that the sun had gone down and darkness wrapped around the Cotswold village. Nate had grabbed a torch as well as the lead and set off towards the village high street, but the long way round. It was a walk they were both familiar with, down the country lanes, and once they'd tackled those devoid of a pavement, he let Branston off the lead. He was well trained and, no longer a puppy, he was usually predictable and well versed at coming to heel. They cut through the churchyard and emerged onto the high street at the far end. From there, they walked along and through the main drag of the village, the rose and thatch pub like a warm beacon at the top of the village green to his left. He'd always liked it in the country pub, with its friendly clientele and staff, and he knew his dad did. Perhaps they'd have a chance for a cheeky pint this weekend. There wasn't always time, given Nate usually had to get back to his plumbing business in Wales, with client demands always high. Leaky toilets and faulty piping rarely had the decency to let him have an extended time off, unless he made special arrangements. Branston trotted along beside him, stopping to sniff the odd shrub or patch on the pavement, lifting his nose in curiosity as he detected different scents on the air, and they continued all the way to the very end before they crossed back over when the pavement ran out before the road led its way out of the village. Coming back down the other side towards Little Woodville's centre again, he stopped when he saw the bookshop cafe and peered in the window. Sebastian and Belle had done well. This place was once a photography studio, but that had been some time ago, and it was now a far cry from what it had once been. Nate didn't know Belle more than in passing, but he remembered Sebastian and had bumped into him enough times at the Rose and Thatch to be friendly. It would be good to catch up with him again if he got the chance. Perhaps he'd come back in the daytime to check out the bookshop cafe properly on his next visit, bring his dad for cake and a coffee, or mug of tea, or a light lunch of soup if he'd read the menu inside the front door correctly. It looked like the cafe was at the rear, but he couldn't see all that well now that it was dark, even when he tried to shine his torch through the glass, and he didn't want to trigger any sort of alarm. They walked on. Sebastian was in business with his girlfriend, and Nate wondered how it would feel to be that secure with someone. For some people, it worked out. Maybe one day it would for him too. He passed the bank, the little post office, and headed towards where they'd turn and go over the humpback bridge. It was as they got closer that there was enough light from the nearby street lamps to see a figure on the bridge lift something that looked like a stick in the air, as if she was going to throw it. That was it. While Branston was obedient, he was still a dog after all, and at the sight of a potential stick, off he went. Nate swore. He broke into a run. "Branston!" He rounded the corner, and while Branston emitted a low growl, a woman bent over in front of him, her thick, chunky knit cardigan almost down to her knees, flapping around her and getting in her way as she engaged with his dog in what could only be described as a tug of war over what was definitely a stick. Nate held back before commenting. The battle was a bit fun to watch. "He'll win, you know," he said eventually. The woman turned, and as she did, must have lessened her grip because Branston triumphantly ran towards Nate, stick in his mouth. Nate bent down to stroke Branston as he obediently came to his master's side. To him, this would have been nothing more than a game, but when Nate looked up, the woman seemed upset. "Are you all right?" She said nothing. "It's only a game." He tried to joke. She didn't say anything, but her eyes filled with more tears. Shit. He wasn't great with women. He'd been told by one that he didn't have an emotional bone in his body. He wasn't sure that was entirely true, but he knew how easy it was to say the wrong thing when emotions were involved. He walked closer, took a clean tissue from his pocket and handed it to her. Her voice wobbled when she thanked him and added, "Don't mind me. I just got a bit emotional standing here. It brings back memories. That's all. And I know it's only a game." Branston trotted up to her as if he understood, and Nate muttered, "I'll be damned," when the dog dropped the stick at her feet. That got a laugh as she crouched down and put her face close to Branston's, her hands fussing his cheeks, not worrying that she didn't know the dog. "What's his name?" She looked up at Nate. She had glossy, mahogany-coloured hair in a slightly off-centre parting, and rich, dark brown eyes almost the same colour. He was momentarily lost for words. "Branston," he managed. She'd obviously been oblivious to Nate calling him moments ago. She focused her attentions back on the dog. "Well, hello, Branston. I'd be happy to throw a stick for you, but I think the Greene is a much better place to be playing than here near the road." "What were you doing anyway? It's kind of a bit dark to be throwing sticks." She stood up tall again, stick in hand, Branston looking up at her and then down at the stick as though waiting for action. "I can see well enough with the street lamps, and I was playing poo sticks. Not really the best time, but I just felt like it. It was hard to resist when there was a stick in my path." When she smiled, it sent all kinds of sensations fizzing through his body. "Wait a minute. Did you say poo sticks?" He pulled a face. He hoped Branston didn't have any of the remnants around his mouth. "That's kind of disgusting." She began to laugh. "Pooh with an H, as in Winnie the Pooh." He shook his head. "Still don't get it." "Really?" "Really?" He liked the way she didn't know him, and yet talked to him as though she did. "You've never heard of it?" "Can't say I have. Tell me more." He wanted to keep her talking, this woman he'd met quite unexpectedly. "You can play poo sticks from any bridge over running water, so this location is perfect. Each player has to drop a stick on the upstream side of the bridge, and whoever's stick first appears on the downstream side wins the game." "Neat." She frowned. "Are you making fun of me?" "Not at all. Promise." "So, can I play?" "Now?" "Why not?" She looked around. "Well, it's a bit dark to find another stick, but how about you give it a go with this one we have?" "Sounds good to me." He took the stick when she handed it to him. I usually hold it high up in the air and drop it, but you don't have to. I only do that because my nephew always insists I do it, and it's a hard habit to break. So kids love this game? He questioned, his eyebrows lifting. Kids and adults alike. She smiled before warning. Watch out for cars when you run across. Nate put Branston on the lead. He'll run with me otherwise. Give me your torch and I'll wait with Branston over the other side. Just like that, as though they weren't strangers. Nate waited for them both to cross. Then he leaned over, and as the moonlight cast its glow across the surface of the stream below, adding to the light given by the street lamp, he dropped the stick, saw it hit the water, and began to travel beneath the bridge. Looking both ways in case any cars were coming, he legged it across to the other side and, sure enough, as he leaned over and the girl shone the torch down below, the stick, moments later, made its way out. Yay! She cheered, probably the way she cheered for her nephew. But he appreciated it. My first game of poo sticks at 38, eh? Better late than never, she shrugged. I'm Morgan, by the way. Nate. He held out a hand for her to shake after she handed him the torch. It's very nice to meet you, Morgan. Likewise. When he checked his watch, he realised it looked a little rude, and he didn't actually want to leave. I'm conscious of the time because I'm visiting my dad. He wasn't home when we arrived, but he should be now, or at least soon enough. Your dad lives here? She seemed to realise something. I thought you looked familiar. I think we may have gone to the same high school. I was a couple of years behind you from memory. Are you sure? I think I'd have remembered you. He really could do with a filter sometimes rather than making it obvious he thought she was attractive. I didn't hang around the village once I was done with school. I went to university, got a job and didn't come back all that often. That makes two of us. She was smiling again, and he liked that. What's so funny? I can't believe you grew up here, but you never knew how to play poo sticks. Me neither, although the woods were more my domain than the stream. Snowdrop woods are pretty impressive in whatever season. She was fussing Branston, but flipped back to the start of their conversation. Who's your dad? Branston had already fallen for her, and was sitting beside this woman as though he didn't want to be taken away. Trevor. He doesn't live too far from here. I know Trevor. She beamed. I've just been with him for dinner, as it happens. Ah, the legendary dinners. I should have known. I'm a bit earlier than he was expecting me. Your dad has been going to the dinners for years. He's lovely. And he's been really supportive lately. Particularly at the funeral. Ah, you went to Elena's funeral too. Dad told me all about it. Sad. But it sounds like most of the village were there. She must have been popular. She nodded. It wasn't ever the way I'd have described Mum before I came back here. But now I've realised how many friends she had. What a part of the village she was. I guess I didn't always see it when I was younger. Shit. He'd put his foot right in it, not realising it wasn't just any funeral. It was her mother's. Me and my big mouth. I apologise, and I'm really sorry for your loss. Thank you. She barely met his gaze, preferring to focus her attentions on Branston. Nate felt for this woman. He really did, because he'd been through it himself. Losing his mother. The funeral had been draining, emotional. He knew what it was like with well wishes and kindness that you couldn't feel because you were so numb. He and his dad scattered his mum's ashes at the foot of the grand old oak tree in the garden at his dad's home, aptly named Oak Cottage. Is that why you came home? He asked. To be here for your mum? He didn't remember her, but then again, he'd been away for some time, and his visits didn't always involve socialising too much, given they were usually quite rushed, with a business to get back to. Yeah. It's what you do, isn't it? Put family first. There was no disputing that Morgan was an attractive woman. He'd never had a particular type. Perhaps that had been his problem all along. But right now, aside from the aura of sadness around this woman, she was ticking a lot of boxes. Listen to him. She was grieving and probably after a sympathetic ear, rather than a man lusting after her. And if the sparkling ring on a very important finger was anything to go by, she was already very much spoken for. It is. It's what I'm trying to do anyway, he said. Then Trevor is lucky. But he's all right, isn't he? He certainly seemed in good form earlier. Good to know. But I worry about him all on his own. I wouldn't mind knowing he's somewhere where he has people looking out for him. Why was he telling her all of this? Probably because he hadn't really spoken with anyone about it until now. Least of all, Trevor. I'm his only family, and I live far away. Too far to get here quickly in an emergency. She looked as though she understood exactly where he was coming from, but she added, You know he won't ever leave the village, don't you? I can tell because my mum was the same way. I just want what's best for him. You might have to be the one to move, she teased. Although was it teasing, or was she being totally serious? He wouldn't mind betting it was the latter. He smiled. You know, you might be right. He fussed Branston on the head. We'd better get going. See if Dad's back at the house and not panicking that we've disappeared into the night. Me too. It's getting late. She gave a shiver and it was almost instinct to want to put his arm around her and warm her up. Thanks for the introduction to poo sticks. You're welcome, she grinned. I'll be having a word with Trevor about never teaching you that as a young boy. Maybe I'll see you around. Maybe, she said as he and Branston turned to make their way to the opposite side of the humpback bridge. He looked back to watch Morgan walk away, but she'd already gone. Probably not a bad thing, because he couldn't deny she was attractive, that given half the chance he wouldn't mind getting to know her better, and given his track record, that could only lead to trouble. It usually did. Nate and Branston plodded on. Even in the dark, the village was pretty, and he could see why his dad wouldn't want to leave it behind. But Nate still worried about his dad being on his own. And right now, he had a plumbing business in Wales, a business he couldn't walk away from just like that. It wasn't practical long-term for his dad to be all alone. And last week, when a bungalow had come up for sale 3 doors down from Nate's house, it had caught his eye because it would be perfect for Trevor. And then Nate would be around to look after him and never let anything happen to him. Because that was his biggest fear, not being there when his family needed him. Chapter 3. Morgan was Belle's first customer of the day at the bookshop cafe. Having bypassed the books, she'd gone straight to the cafe at the back and clasped her hands together in front of her. I'm hoping your pancakes are on the menu. Always. And a portion of pancakes coming right up. Belle smiled. I thought your sister was coming down today. She is, but she'll be a while, and as I'm making lunch for us, I thought I deserved a treat first thing. Too right. Coffee too? Yes, please. As Belle set about getting everything ready and making the batter, Morgan told her what she and her sister planned to get through today. The list was extensive, but they'd do as much as possible. She's staying over, which is great because I reckon we'll be shattered after doing this. And with the kids in tow, it won't be as quick as we'd like. Wow, she's bringing the kids. Belle was busy cracking the eggs into a well in the centre of the bowl of flour. Without any customers yet, it gave them a chance to chat. And just by the nature of the environment, a cosy cafe and a front shop full of books, Morgan felt a sense of calm. She has to. The farm can't look after itself, so Henry will need to focus his attentions on that. And it's easy enough for us to have the kids playing nearby in the cottage. It's great to see them too. I don't see them enough. Belle had taken a carton of milk from the fridge and a measuring jug too, and as she poured, Morgan mentioned she'd bumped into someone on her way home from last night's dinner at Snowdrop Cottage. Who? Belle clearly thought Morgan was going to mention a local she knew as she whisked the pancake mixture with enthusiasm, but her focus changed when Morgan said the name Nate. Belle's whisk paused, but not for long, as she wouldn't want the lumps. Her body turned partially towards her friend. Trevor's son, Nate. Sebastian came over and grabbed the coffee in the thermos Belle must have made for him earlier.